Okay, I think we can make a start. Seems most people are here. So I'd like to start and say thank you to everyone who is attending this seminar by Stephanie Jacobs. And of course, thank you, Stephanie, for agreeing to do this seminar for us, for the Bicommunal network of Cypriot youth. Turn off their microphone. Sorry, thanks. It's really important for us as young people to see how we used to live together in the past and how Cyprus and Cypriot society was before the war and before all the conflict. So Stephanie, thank you for your research basically, and thank you for doing this for us. Stephanie is, for those who don't know her, she's a foreign policy expert with the Australian federal government. She has a Bachelor of Arts from Monash University, a Master of International Relations from the University of Melbourne, and a PhD in History from Flinders University. Her thesis involves an ethnographical study of the intercommunality between Greek and Turkish Cypriots in the former mixed villages of Cyprus from about the 1930s to the 1960s, and also the experiences of the Cypriot diaspora in Australia. Her topic was inspired by the loving friendship between her Greek Cypriot grandfather and his Turkish Cypriot best friend. Stephanie, welcome. I would like to give the floor to Michalis Leontiadis for 1 or 2 minutes, who is going to say a few things before the talk.
First of all, I'm not sure if I first have to say good morning, good afternoon, or good night, because we are on 3 different time zones. But I would just say Yasas, Merhaba to everyone. We all consider generally supporters of reunification as family members, no matter age. It's just a common cause that we are all working together. So how we met Stephanie is a bit of a romantic story, I would say, because in summer with the friends or in the coordinating team, we were just trying to strive to try and find on internet some stories which share the relationships of the two communities. And we just came across one of Stephanie's blog. We all got so amazed because there are several stories who talked about friendship. And for us, it was an easy choice just sharing Stephanie's amazing work. And then we just came in touch with her. We had a Skype and we saw how lovely she is as a person. And we straight away considered her as another member of our family. And according to our network's creation, for those who don't know, the network was created officially, let's say, in July 2019. It was an attempt of students in the UK at first to fight against segregation in societies, which unfortunately brought compatriots like us and friends not being able to share the same ground and do some common events in UK. And then we just said, you know, let's do something from scratch, mainly to socialize, to bring people together, to share our thoughts about how we want to build the Cyprus of the future. And here we are together. Thanks to many friends of the network who were not studying in the UK. Especially last year, we had a lot of requests and suggestions for us to expand and take the next big step to remove the UK part and become a broader network for all the students, the youth generally all around the world. And that's what we came up this year with many obstacles, but yes, here we are hosting our first event this year. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much. Well, hello, Yasas Merhaba. Greetings from Melbourne, Australia. It's quite customary in Australia to acknowledge the traditional custodians, in which I am presenting tonight. So I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, and I would like to pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging. I would like to thank Angelos and Michalis so much for warmly welcoming me into the family and for hosting me tonight. I'm really appreciative to be with you all this evening and this morning and whatever time it is in the different respective parts of the world that we're all meeting. I also would like to say that I share your vision very much so, and your mission, sorry, I'm just getting my notes back up, to foster the harmonious coexistence of Cypriots. And I really commend all of the efforts to date that your community's been able to achieve. And I'm sure once COVID has started to ease up a little bit, that there'll be a lot more momentum going forward. I'm just going to share my screen and begin the presentation. So let me just open this. I hope that's working for everyone. So I would like to just quickly give a quick introduction to myself and to tell you how I got to this point and the journey I've been through. I grew up in Australia as a third generation Australian. I'm half Cypriot, a quarter German, quarter Dutch, so a bit of a mix. And I was very close with my Yaya and Bapu growing up, but I didn't know all that much about Cyprus. Obviously, I knew some of the religious components. I knew some of the swear words, knew what vasticho and flaunes were, but really about the country itself, all I knew was that my Bapu's best friend was Turkish Cypriot. And so once I was 20 years old and I first traveled to Europe, I was very excited to go to Paris and Rome and London, and my yaya guilt tripped me into, of course, visiting the relatives in Cyprus. And so I didn't really know what to think. I didn't have all that much of an idea of what to expect either. And I got on the plane from Thessaloniki to Larnaca, and I was sitting on the plane and I looked outside and it was nighttime and I saw the lights of Cyprus. And all of a sudden I was just overwhelmed with this strange feeling of belonging and identity. And I just was uncontrollably crying. And it was very strange for me. And I got to Cyprus and I felt this strong connection there and met relatives for the first time and saw relatives and people who looked like me, and that was very exciting. And so when I returned to Australia and I was doing my master's in international relations, I thought I would study a bit about Cyprus because I heard other stories when I was there about the relations between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. And when I started to study a few projects on Cyprus, I realized that those stories weren't really reflected in the literature and that there was a real gap in the existing literature. And so I then decided to do a PhD part-time, learn Greek and Turkish, not very well, but got there good enough, I guess, and undertook this journey because I realized that the last generation of people still alive who remembered living together were dying. And many people I've interviewed over the last few years have unfortunately passed away. And it's so terribly sad, but I'm really so proud and happy that at least I've captured their stories and that they have a legacy now through my project and that we can try and do good through this work. So I just wanted to give some broad context about myself and the project and how I got here. And I'll now begin. So this is just a brief outline. Obviously, you all know the history of Cyprus, but I'll just give a little bit of for context and talk about the importance of reclaiming history, some overview of my interview subjects, and then go into the actually interesting stuff about the stories of intercommunality, identity, displacement and loss, and reconnection and hope. Okay, so as I mentioned, I did a PhD, and as part of that, I interviewed 72 elderly Greek and Turkish Cypriots, so captured their stories of childhood and early adulthood prior to the conflict and division in Cyprus. So 40 interviews were conducted in Cyprus, and that spanned both the north and south, and 32 interviews in Australia, covering 6 of our 8 states and territories. Just as I said, a bit of historical context. In 1960, the demographic makeup of Cyprus was 77% Greek Cypriots and 18% Turkish Cypriots, and they're also quite a significant population of minorities as well. And so that really leads to the next bit, which is looking at the history of Cyprus. And I'm not going to step through the whole lot, but I will say that Cyprus has been greatly influenced over the years by regional powers through ruling and the systemic movement of people, as well as the establishment of political, legal and religious institutions and the social organization of its diverse populations. And in many ways, we really can say that Cyprus is a multicultural society due to all the immigrant populations from all over the world over centuries. I think I'll just quickly talk about the Ottoman rule. After 4 centuries of Latin rule, the Ottomans came, they implemented the millet system, and therefore there was a strict divide of religious communities rather than ethno-linguistic communities. And what occurred was, under the Venetian rule prior to Ottoman rule, there was severe underpopulation of Cyprus. So the Ottomans then decided to order families to come from Anatolia, from present-day Turkey, to Cyprus to help populate the island. So that's the beginning of Turks in Cyprus. And obviously, there's been centuries now, and most of that time, there's been very strong intercommunality. The British in 1878 began to administer and occupy Cyprus. And during their time of administration, they made no attempt to move away from the strategies to divide the Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities, and rather they furthered the Ottoman established practices and policies of communal segregation. This is evident from the decrease in numbers of mixed villages, as well as the continuation of segregated schools within Cyprus as well. And throughout the British period, the population of Cyprus was predominantly rural and significantly illiterate. And that is important because, and I'll speak about it a bit more, but often history is told from the perspective of the political elites, but the majority of people were farmers and rural everyday people, and their voices are not reflected very much in literature. And that's why it's important to recognize that we're not talking about a very minute minority here. The rural populations were the majority. I also thought I would just quickly mention that during the British period, we saw, after the First World War, huge immigration occur, and Cypriots moved to the UK, Australia, the US and South Africa mostly. And we also saw Cypriots, both Greek and Turkish Cypriots, serve in the British Army during World War I and World War II. So the beginning of civil unrest, we can say really that was, the unrest was amplified. Under the British period, we saw an increase in nationalism, both Greek and Turkish Cypriot. We're very well aware in 1954, EOKA, a guerrilla organization, was formed, and their anti-colonial movement was coupled with a desire for NLCS union with Greece. And whilst EOKA imitated other anti-colonial struggles, it was very unique in demanding not just independence, but union with another country. In response to EOKA's endeavours for NLCS, the Turkish Cypriot community desired partition, Taksim, and despite the fact that future trouble loomed large, the British administration strengthened these separatist aspirations, and in 1958 tolerated the formation of TMT. We also know that the British recruited Turkish Cypriots as auxiliary police to fight EOKA's insurrection, and of course violent confrontations then occurred. And consequently, tensions between the Greek Cypriots and the British escalated during this period, and it ended in 1960 with the independence, the Declaration of Cyprus's independence. So after this I guess independence did not satisfy the aspirations of the political right amongst either the Greek or Turkish Cypriots, as both communities continued to pursue their aims of Enosis and Taksim. And as a result, intercommunal conflicts occurred throughout the island during the 1960s. Greek and Turkish Cypriots were both killed and displaced during this period. However, Turkish Cypriots experienced much greater displacement, as well as more missing persons and persons killed than Greek Cypriots. And the intercommunal conflicts prompted the involvement of the United Nations, who in 1963 deployed a peacekeeping force to prevent further hostilities. And I think it's really important often the conflicts in the 1960s are written out of history books and not acknowledged or discussed very much. And it's important to acknowledge the suffering of both communities during that period. We obviously know that the coup d'etat of July 15, 1974 resulted from escalated inter-ethnic strife, and then it was carried out by the pro-union factions who identified themselves as Iokavita with the support of the Greek military junta. And 5 days later, the Turkish military offensive occurred. And since then, obviously, the northern third of the island remains occupied. So we saw a huge mass movement of people. We saw 180,000 Greek Cypriots and 60,000 Turkish Cypriots be displaced as a result. And so for such a small population, this is significantly traumatic, and we're still seeing some of the scars today. Cyprus obviously remains divided, and in 1983, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus was proclaimed. And absolutely, they're very much reliant politically and economically on Turkey, and that's because they're not internationally recognized, so they're very much restricted. On the 23rd of April 2003, the Turkish Cypriot authorities surprisingly opened up the checkpoints at the previously uncrossable Green Line, and that divided the north and south of the island. And since then, Greek and Turkish Cypriots have been able to cross between the two sides. And I think it's really important to note that there's been an absence of ethnic violence since the checkpoints opened. And finally, I'm sure none of this is all that new to you, but today the UN continues to guard the Green Line, and efforts to reunify the island continue. And there's been many attempts and many failed attempts, and it's been a big roller coaster for many of us, and hopefully we'll get there one day. But that's the situation we're faced with at the moment. So moving on to the importance of reclaiming history. So the recent history of Cyprus is very much dominated by the Turkish invasion, by the subsequent military occupation of 37% of the island. It's also dominated by the displacement of both Greek and Turkish Cypriots from their homes, businesses and farms, and contradictory truths. And that very much leads to my next point, that the recent history of Cyprus is told by the members of the political elites. So this research is focused on looking at the history of Cyprus through a subaltern looking glass, from the perspective of rural and working people, to reveal previously buried histories and events of the past, the untold stories of everyday people whose destinies were determined by the political elites and whose stories were told from the point of view of those political elites. What's really important to note here is that there are two distinct post-1974 narratives commonly held and conveyed among Cypriots. The first is that of Greek Cypriots, who hold that the times before 1974 were peaceful and harmonious, and nothing happened during the 20 years previously which could justify the invasion taking place. And the Turkish Cypriot narrative holds that the times before 1974 were tumultuous and volatile, relations were always difficult, so the 1974 invasion was therefore justified. My view is that we cannot move forward if we look back to the history of Cyprus with one eye closed. Therefore, both official narratives need to be deconstructed to allow for a comprehensive account of Cyprus's recent history and to foster relations between the two groups going forward. Oh, I just skipped over one. Oops, sorry. I'll just quickly go through my interview subjects, and I mentioned to you my motivation was to uncover these previously buried stories of Greek and Turkish Cypriot intercommunality. So therefore I decided to undertake fieldwork myself. And so I did fieldwork in both Cyprus and Australia. And here you can see the gender and ethnicity split. And so I tried to balance it as much as I could, but it was very difficult to try and get an equal balance of men and women, because a lot of the community leaders I engaged with would often offer me men from the villages instead of women, and so I had to specifically ask for women. But often women were carers, and they were quite busy looking after grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and it was often quite difficult to find women to interview as well. So this ended up being the split. In Cyprus, in 2015, I spent 2 months doing my interviews, and I decided to pick these 3 former mixed villages. So Aya Arini was a Turkish Cypriot majority mixed village from the 1920s to 1960. Polis Chrysochous was a Greek Cypriot majority, and Alaminos was around a 50-50 split. So with a PhD, you're limited in what you can do, and therefore I try to find a balance between these 3 different demographic makeups of these villages. In Australia, I interviewed 32 Cypriots, and they came from villages from all over the country. So it's actually really nice to be able to have quite a wide spread as well from this data set. Here you can see the decade of birth of the interviewees, and I was actually really surprised to find anyone in the 1950s who actually had memories of these good times, but I found out that even up until 1974, for many people, there were still very good relations. So I was able to interview quite a few people born in the 1950s and get really rich data from them as well. And in Australia, the average age of people actually was a bit older. So let's just move to the next bit. So also I looked at trying to find quite a good balance between people who grew up in both the north and south, and we ended up with pretty good balance in the end. What was interesting, so this is the mixed villages of the interview participants. So in Cyprus, 100% of people I interviewed were from mixed villages. In Australia, I had to be a bit more picky. Australia is quite different from the UK. The UK, most Greek and Turkish Cypriots migrated to North London. There were larger populations, and they were actually congregated quite closely together. In Australia, the Cypriots were very much dispersed. We have a huge country here, so I did travel very wide and far, but finding people to interview who specifically met my criteria was a little bit difficult. So what I did was I expanded the criteria in Australia to include Cypriots who lived in neighbouring villages, neighbouring monocultural villages, so who still had memories of intercommunality and friendships between the 2 communities, although they lived in a monocultural village. So that's why there's this interesting split here. And I thought I would just highlight the rural and urban population splits during the childhoods of my interview subjects, and you can see that it was significantly rural. And I guess also to mention that the mixed villages decreased in numbers during the British rule. Okay, so now on to the interesting stuff and looking at the intercommunality in Cyprus and the results from this project. So the first thing I wanted to discuss was language. And interestingly, the majority of my interview participants spoke both Greek and Turkish Cypriot, Cypriot Turkish and Cypriot Greek. And you can see with the Turkish Cypriots, there were very few who spoke Turkish only. There were quite a lot that spoke Greek only, but many Greek Cypriots did speak Turkish. I guess one of the reasons, though, is because the Greek Cypriots were the majority, so many Turkish Cypriots did learn to speak Greek because that was the language of the majority, and it was useful to know. Many of my interviewees had little or no schooling, and they spoke the other language as children and learned the other language from friends. 21 out of 24 Turkish Cypriots whom I interviewed in Cyprus still spoke Kypriota, more than 40 years after the war and the separation from their Greek-speaking neighbours. So these people were truly bilingual. They grew up with both languages, they used them, they thought in these languages, and many people I spoke with said once the checkpoints opened, the language came flooding back to them. So I was really astonished that most of the interviews I did of Turkish Cypriots in Cyprus was in Kypriota in the end. And it's interesting because in many ways they've actually preserved Kypriota because they still speak it as it was spoken back in the 60s and 70s. So I just give some quotes now regarding language. So Costa said, Greek schools and Turkish schools were separated. I went to a Turkish school for 3 months. I was embarrassed that my Turkish Cypriot friends could speak Greek, but I couldn't speak Turkish. I learned enough Turkish for conversation. I just wanted to learn Turkish to speak with some friends. And Ali said, I did have a couple of friends who would go to both schools. Some Turkish Cypriots also went to the Greek schools, and some Greek Cypriots, including my friend Vasily, went to Turkish school. The teachers were welcoming and friendly, but most people learned both languages even without going to school. Saraman said, I lived in Government House, Strovolos, between 1952 and 1962. We had Greek Cypriot neighbours. I learnt Cypriot Greek from their children and spoke both Turkish and Greek. I also heard stories of Turkish Cypriots who spoke Greek as their mother tongue. And here you can see where the arrow is pointing that actually from the census in 1931, 2.5% of the Turkish Cypriot population spoke Greek as a mother tongue. And this was very problematic for this group of people because when the war happened in 1974 and they were forced to migrate north, they were living in an environment where the language was completely unfamiliar to them and had to learn Turkish very quickly. But this was very disruptive to their lives and very difficult for many of these people. Community level relationships also extended to religious festivals, and it was very common for my interview participants to participate in the religious festivals of the other group. Nafia said, we would all celebrate Christmas and Easter together, and they would celebrate our events like Bayram. Andrea said, when we had Easter, my mother would give me flowers and red eggs, and I took them to a few Turkish families close to us. One side of our yard was attached to a Turk's home. We were so close, like a family. We respect their religion, they respect our religion. And Ali said, we lived like brothers. When there was Ramazan and then there was a party, we would have bands come to play music. The whole village would celebrate together. So nice. We'd kill our animals and put them in the oven. Same story for Easter as well as St. George on the 23rd of April. Yordani said, every Easter we would make flowers. My mother and all Greek Cypriots gave these as presents to their Turkish Cypriot friends. So my mother would send me with flowers to our Turkish Cypriot neighbours. One day I made 13 such visits. This would happen at Easter and other times. When they had their Ramazan, they would send us their special breads. This was like an exchange. We gave to them and they gave to us. Weddings in Cyprus were almost identical between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. They would last for 3 days and they would go Saturday, Sunday, Monday. Monday was commonly the day of the Gumbari, where the Gumbaro or Gumbara would pay for all of the food and celebrations for that day. The music was very similar, and really it was just the religious components that were the stark differences between the two different types of weddings. Haki said, a typical Cypriot wedding involves pinning money on the bride and groom. Both Greek and Turkish Cypriots would do this. It's a Cypriot custom. Costa said, all of the young Turkish people were good friends. There was no difference between Greeks or Turks. We would go to their weddings and to the mosque. They went to our weddings, christenings, even church all together. The Turks were very respectful of our religion as their religion is based on it. And this is actually a really interesting viewpoint, and this is not related to the weddings, but there was this belief of many Greek Cypriots that because the Turkish Cypriots did believe in Jesus as a prophet and believe in Mary, they had this respect for Christianity. And it was interesting because many of the Christians really focused on the similarities between Islam and Christianity, and likewise with the Muslims. And they very much looked at the similarities and how that bound them together rather than looking at their differences. And I even heard stories of Turkish Cypriots when they would walk past a church. So as Greek Cypriots, we would do our cross 3 times, and the Turkish Cypriots would stroke their hand along the wall of the church. And that was the way that they would show their sign of respect to the institution and to the Christian neighbours that they had. Andrea said, when we had weddings, the whole village would get involved, both Greek and Turkish Cypriots. We danced the same dances. Sometimes the Turks would come to the church if they had problems. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the coming slides. Miaphora said, you couldn't pick the Turkish Cypriots. They look and spoke like the Greek Cypriots. I had a Turkish Cypriot neighbor. She was getting married, so she asked me to go and decorate the house. We got along with all our Turkish Cypriot neighbors. I wish things were the same, even for 1 week when I went back to Cyprus. And Niarchos said, Turks would come to our celebrations like weddings. Even some would come to church on Sundays. I think they were believers, mostly women though not many men. One Turkish man was even baptized Christian Orthodox. He was 45 or 50 years old and was baptized Andreas. He did not want to go with the Turks when the invasion happened. He had always mixed with the Greeks. And it's really interesting because I'd heard from quite a few of my interview participants of the Greek Cypriots that many of the Turkish Cypriots, they believed had faith in Christianity, and there was a group called Linobambaki, which means linen and cotton, and it referred to a group of people who adhered to both Islam and Christianity. And it was interesting to hear stories of Greek Cypriots who, rather than being judgmental or critical of Turkish Cypriots having a perceived faith in Christianity, they were very open and welcoming to it. And it was, I found that quite beautiful, to be honest. Here we can see that the amount of people who entered the religious house of the other group, it was, sorry, let me just check, 58% of my interviewees had entered into the mosque or church of the other group. And it was interesting because Australians, more than those in Cyprus, had actually entered, and Turkish Cypriots more than Greek Cypriots, and men more than women. But really what this data points to is that each religion was not all that foreign to the other group, and they were quite familiar with it through weddings and different celebrations. And often people would go with their friends to Turkish Cypriots, would go to with their Greek Cypriot friends on Sunday to church, or they would go out of curiosity. Or they would come and ring the church bells with their Greek Cypriot friends, and Greek Cypriots likewise would go to the mosque as well. And so this was demonstrates that there was close relations and respect for one another's religion, and they didn't see each other's religion as a threat to their own. And it was really interesting as well because religious acceptance and tolerance also extended to actually doing chores for each other on sacred days. So Andrea said, when we had Bayram or other celebrations, we would look after their animals in the fields, and they would do the same for us. And I heard from many people that in villages, in mixed villages, on the Friday when the Muslims would go to mosque, the Greek Cypriots would look after their animals in their fields. And then on Sundays when the Greek Cypriots would go to church, then the Muslims will look after their animals in fields, and also children as well. And so there was this real cooperation and understanding of the importance of religion in society, and trying to help and support one another in any way they could. Community level relationships also extended to working life. All but 2 interviewees remember Greek and Turkish Cypriots doing similar work and working with the other group. And here from this image, you can see strikers with signs in both Greek and Turkish. Andreas said, we worked together and we even went on strike together. We were united. We even had the same soccer team. We were playing Greeks and Turks together. And Nevzat said, I learnt my hairdressing trade from a Greek Cypriot, and he also spoke Turkish, and we had Greek and Turkish customers. Andrea said, I used to be a builder. My boss was a Turkish Cypriot. I became a member of the Builders Union and eventually joined the Communist Party. We would do similar jobs. There was not specific jobs we would do separately. And I love this story. Georgia said, next to Mum's house there were fields owned by a Turkish Cypriot. He planted watermelon. He had 2 daughters and they used to sleep in the fields. My father became friends with the man and offered for his daughters to sleep at our house. For 1 year, I shared my bed with one of his daughters. We were good friends. My brother would go up with this man and sell the watermelons up at Troodos. This was up to 1974, prior to the war. There was also cooperation between neighbouring villages, as I mentioned, and Nevzat said that this olive press was owned by the Katmi family of the village of Lemba, and it's now held by the museum in Bafos, and both Greek and Turkish Cypriots from neighbouring villages would use it, and Nevzat said that That's because all were welcome, as the Greeks were like family. Anastasia said there was a Turkish village very close to ours. The Turkish Cypriot women would come from one side and the Greek Cypriot from the other side and meet near the swamps. They were the best of friends. They ate and worked together. The lady who helped my mother to give birth to me was Turkish. Panayota said the Turks in the neighboring village would invite the whole Greek village to a wedding by putting a big candle at the church. The night before, they would bring some music, and it was all ladies, no men. And Dimos said we would have school excursions to their Turkish school and they would come to ours. We were very friendly amongst ourselves. We would all go to the beach together. We would eat and drink together. There was a significant amount of Greek and Turkish Cypriot volunteers that served together in the British Army during World War II, 35,000 in fact. And Nevzat actually served in the regiment, and you can see him highlighted in yellow there. And he said that Greeks and Turks were brothers. And this is very consistent with the research of historian Jan Asmussen, who said that there are no hints in the British public records of any ethnic conflicts within the Cyprus regiment, and that this is exactly in line with the combined memories of Turkish and Greek Cypriot war veterans. Personal level relationships. So we've moved from the community level relationships about how the society worked together and cooperated and supported one another and accepted each other. And now we're moving on to the personal level relationships, and these are much deeper relationships, of course. So Kostas, this is actually my bapu. He said, next to me, there was a Turkish family. They had a young boy like me. We used to live together and grew up together until I was 21 years old when I left Cyprus. We went everywhere together. We were more than friends. We were brothers. Themistocles said, my first girlfriend was Turkish Cypriot. My parents didn't care. I had more Turkish Cypriot friends than Greek. And Sam said, when I was 15, I lived and worked at Lidra Palace. I was a page boy. I shared my bed with a Turkish Cypriot boy, Ibrahim. We were good friends. We shared just about everything and went everywhere together. Sadia, she played with her Greek Cypriot friends in the lush fields of Alaminos, and it was in those fields that she learnt the Greek alphabet. So actually her Greek Cypriot friends would come and they would get sticks and they would write the alphabet in the dirt, and that's how they taught their Turkish Cypriot friends the Greek alphabet, because many people could speak each other's languages, but they were illiterate in the other language and they couldn't read and write. And so this is how she learned. She celebrated Panegyri in the village with the Greek Cypriots, and during the Turkish military's air raids of Kokina in 1964, several Greek Cypriots from her village from Alaminos were killed. And 15-year-old Sadia at the time was so upset, and she said, I was crying and crying, and she attended their funerals. Maria, she had many Turkish Cypriot friends, and during the school holidays, she and her friends would work as fruit pickers for a man in Morphu. And there was a problem. Maria was the only Greek Cypriot, and the Turkish Cypriot boss paid her half the wage of the other girls. So her Turkish Cypriot friends then protested and threatened to quit unless the boss paid the same wage to Maria as that he paid them. And so he bowed to their demands, and Maria's wage was doubled. So even as young kids, they were fighting for each other's rights and equality. Friendships extended to Kumbari, and this is really beautiful actually to see these relationships. Hersia said, your Bapu's father Yakomi was Kumbara for my wedding, which was extremely beautiful when I was visiting Aya Irini, my Bapu's village, and to hear that. Artam said, I was one of 3 Kumbari for a Greek Cypriot friend's wedding. I bought presents and food for the wedding. And Vimos said, sometimes they would even be our Kumbari, a Turkish man, best man in a Greek wedding. In fact, my sister has a Turkish Cypriot best man. The best man traditionally pays for the wedding. However, strictly speaking, the church would not allow Muslim Kumbari, so we had ways of getting around it. And he actually told me that what they would do is they would put a fake Greek Cypriot Kumbaro in the church to perform the rituals and the ceremony. And then when he would sign his name, he would actually sign the name of the Turkish Cypriot man. And then after the church event, for everything else, the Turkish Cypriot Kumbaro would then take on that role. in every other way. So that's how they got around those religious barriers. Intermarriages. Now, this is I'm the first person to actually quantify intermarriage in Cyprus, and it actually was quite commonplace. 67% of my interview participants recall intermarriages taking place. So Ramadan said, my grandfather married a Greek Cypriot and they had 12 children. There were no problems. My brother's first girlfriend was Greek Cypriot. Amir said, I knew of an intermarriage between a Turkish Cypriot man and a Greek Cypriot woman. They still live in Morphu. And Naila said, as a child, I heard stories of unwed Turkish Cypriot women in the 1930s converting to Christianity to marry Greek Cypriot men. These women were Linobamaki, the term I mentioned earlier, people who adhered to both religions. Paraskivou said, my auntie married a Turk and they had 6 children. 3 became Christian and 3 stayed Muslim. And this is a common Islamic practice that if the father is Muslim and the mother is Christian or Jewish, then if they have sons, the sons follow the religion of the father. If they have daughters, then the daughters follow the religion of the mother. And then I asked Father Andreas whether he knew of intermarriage and intermarriages existing in Polis. And he said, intermarriage, not in this village, no. However, Father Andreas is actually Paraskivou's brother. And I thought, surely he remembers if his aunt married a Turk. And I started to think, well, perhaps, because she was very much uneducated and he was very educated. He went to completed high school, he did further studies, he became a priest, he spent a lot of his working life living in Athens. And my assumption that I put here is that often educated people tend to have more of an agenda and they tell you what they want you to hear and how you should interpret it. And that's why this project and interviewing subaltern people in the subaltern category of labouring class people is really important, because you do get a different version of history from them, different perspectives and experiences as well. Now, the final element of the personal level relationships I wanted to touch on is what I've coined cross-religious wet nursing or cross-religious milk kinship. And this demonstrates real intimacy between Greek and Turkish Cypriots. So 26 of 40 of my interviewees in Cyprus recalled milk mothers of the other group. Now, in the Quran, it states that if a woman breastfeeds the woman of another child, that woman becomes a child's second mother, and the siblings therefore can't marry, similar to in Christianity with godparents. Like, for instance, I can't marry my god brother. So it's very much a similar concept. And the Turkish Cypriots believed in this very strongly. What is really interesting is that the Greek Cypriots then adopted this understanding, and they practiced this same cultural practice, and some knew that it stemmed from the Turkish Cypriot practice and others thought that it was their own. And so this shows that there were significant relationships between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, because if there were civil or superficial relationships, there's no way you would willingly bind your families with a family of the other group. You would find a Greek Cypriot to feed your child if you're a Greek Cypriot, or a Turkish Cypriot woman to feed your child if you're Turkish Cypriot. You wouldn't let each other feed each other's children. And so I think this is the most significant example of the deep relationships that existed between the two groups. And actually, when the checkpoints opened in 2003, several of my interviewees told me that they visited or were visited by their milk mother or their milk sibling, and they certainly still view this as a very intimate familial relationship. Okay, so Paraskivou said, my mother was the milk mother to a Turkish Cypriot child who now lives in England. When she and her family come to visit Cyprus, they come and visit their sister. They come and visit us every year. Every time she comes down, she's welcome to stay here. Father Andrea said, when my mother went to work, I was a baby, about 6 or 9 months old. She left me with a Turk. Her name was Aisha, to breastfeed me. She was a very good neighbor. I have 2 mothers. Ramadan said, my brother was fed by a Greek Cypriot woman. My mother didn't have any milk. Katie said, my mother, she had a Turkish Cypriot friend who became ill and she couldn't make milk. She was so sick that they brought the sick child to my mother and she breastfed the baby. And up until now, that child would call my mother, mother, because the Turkish people place great importance on breastfeeding and we are like brothers. They used to come and say that the child was my brother. The child saw my mother as his mother also. And Hussein said, my grandmother had been a milk mother for a Greek Cypriot child. A few weeks ago, a Greek Cypriot man came searching for relatives of my grandmother. The man proudly claimed that his wife and my mother are sisters. I would like to just quickly touch on identity, and it was really interesting to graph this chart of identities among the interviewees, and it was really interesting to see the overwhelming majority of participants had a Cypriot or hyphenated Cypriot identity. Very few had Greek or Turkish identities as sole identities. And whilst there was a significant number that identified as Christian, there was none that identified as solely Muslim. And there is research into the religiosity of Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and certainly a lot of the data shows that Turkish Cypriots aren't as religious as the Greek Cypriots are. And I think that's also reflected in this data. But what I found really interesting was this common thread of Cypriot in the identity. So Anastasia said, in the old days, we would say we were all Cypriots. We were not called Greek Cypriot or Turkish Cypriot. We were all Cypriots because we were all born in the same country. Nafia and Nevzat said, we were Turkish Cypriots, but we did not identify with the people from mainland Turkey. Up until the end of British rule, we didn't know anything about Turkey. Ali said, we didn't know much about mainland Greece and Turkey back then. And Andreas said, back then I felt mostly Christian. They did not use terms like Greek and Turkish back then. Now I feel Australian. When it came to displacement and loss, I guess for me, when I first started this project, I thought, oh, I'm just going to touch on everything prior to the conflict, prior to the displacement and the trauma, because that's been so, the research is so significant already in this area. But then I realized it's really hard to then do my project without being able to contextualize it within this period. And so I did touch upon this, these topics in my thesis in the end. And as I mentioned earlier, the displacement of both Greek and Turkish Cypriots from the 1960s has been significant. And even we can see here from the census data from 1891, the spread of the distribution of Turkish Cypriot population has become more and more condensed into specific areas as the years went on. And that shows the decline in the mixed villages and the segregation that was starting to occur between the two communities. Stories of loss experienced by refugees, as well as those who remained in their villages but had to say goodbye to dear friends of the other group, reveal the mourning that was and continues to be experienced due to the deterioration of tight-knit communities and deep friendships. Now, what's really important here, I believe, is we acknowledge the significant loss and trauma that both communities experienced, but often we are very much focused on those who were displaced, and we don't think about those who remained all that much. But they also felt and experienced significant trauma and loss as well. So in my research, I actually looked at the loss experienced by both these groups of people. I'll just give a little bit of information, just some small case studies here. So Greek Cypriots Irini and Kostas were both born in Aya Irini in 1938 and they married in 1957. As children, Irini and Kostas spoke Greek, English and a little Turkish, and they knew enough to converse with their fellow villagers. Both worked in the fields in Aya Irini alongside Turkish Cypriots, and they said that we got along very well. In 1974, with escalating tensions, some Turkish Cypriot girls were captured by Greek Cypriot soldiers and imprisoned in a cafe in the village. After 3 days without food or water, Kostas couldn't leave them suffering. His quote is, "What a terrible thing to do. How could you lock them up? I kept an eye on them and then I got them out and took them home. They had a wash, they got some milk and they went back. I told them not to leave, otherwise our people, they will kill me. I was asked by some other villagers what was I doing. My people threatened to kill me because they said, 'Why did you do such a thing?' They took them to another house. One of our people went there with a bomb. He said he was going to kill them in the house. I heard the bomb go off. I ran. I was wondering what happened and whether the girls were killed. There was crying and screams. I opened up the door. They all came out alive. I cried with joy. They said to me, "What have we done? They're going to kill us." Then the soldiers took them away. I ran up to the soldiers and asked them to let them go home. They did, and I took them home. After the invasion a few months later, Kostas and Irini fled and eventually settled in Episkopi. And since the checkpoints opened in 2003, they've often travelled back to Aya Irini several times to see their old friends. And they said there is still lots of love. They've also met some of those young Turkish girls, now women in their 50s, and their rescuers deeply respected by them and their families. And I think that we hear all these horrific stories about what each community did to one another, but there were some beautiful stories that I heard as well of how they supported one another during this awful period. So Feriha, so this is actually my Bapu's best friend's wife. So Feriha is a Turkish Cypriot woman living in Aya Irini and the widow of Mehmet Emin. She was born in 1934 and she never went to school. As the eldest daughter, she helped raise her younger siblings so that her mother could go to work in the fields. Her family was terribly poor. Despite being illiterate, as a child, Feriha spoke Greek just as well as Turkish, and she worked on the farm with her friends. It was really interesting when I met Feriha and I asked her to sign the consent paperwork for the interview, and she was so embarrassed because she couldn't even write her own name. She was completely illiterate. And I said to her, "Oh, I'm the one who's embarrassed. You can speak 2 languages and I can only speak 1. And I've been to university and I've had this like amazing education." And I just thought it was just remarkable how she was able to speak these 2 languages with 0 schooling. And I had a lot of respect and admiration for her. She said, "We used to go to the fields for work, Greek and Turkish girls. While we were working, we were singing Greek and Turkish songs all together. All together, we were working and singing. They were so close, in fact, that Feriha grieved terribly when her Greek Cypriot friends left the village in 1974. For the first few years, the Turkish Cypriots tried to look after the farms that belonged to their Greek Cypriot friends, expecting them soon to return. But," she said, "we couldn't look after the fields, we couldn't keep on watering the plants, and eventually all of the citrus trees died. After the Greeks left, it was too difficult for us to continue looking after the farms on our own." Now, tending to the trees of the enemy was not her responsibility, but still she carried that guilt with her more than 40 years later. And there was many years where she was actually tending to those trees, but she then had children and she couldn't do it anymore. But this was a very common story that so many people who remained in mixed villages looked after the properties and the farms and fields of those who left, waiting every day for them to return home and ensuring that when they did return home, that their houses and their fields were still in good shape. After the checkpoints opened in 2003, many of her Greek Cypriot friends came to visit her, and actually my great uncle Yordanis met with her and her husband at a checkpoint, and he drove them to his house and put on a big feast for them, and she said, "We were so happy we cried and cried." So there's some beautiful stories there. Reconnection and Hope, and this is the last topic of this talk. Since 2003, 32 of my 40 Cyprus interviewees had crossed through the checkpoints to reunite with old friends. And this is my Bapu and Mehmet Emin. And in July 2013, both at age 87, my Bapu was determined to make the journey to visit his old village. And he made the trip accompanied by many family members, and my mother knocked on the doors of random villages asking for Mehmet Emin. And, I guess I grew up hearing stories from my Bapu of how he and Mehmet were closer than brothers. And my family all knew that a reunion of the 2 men will be the fulfillment of a dream. So my mother eventually found him. And so my Bapu charged towards that cafe and was so eager to reunite with his oldest and best friend after 41 years apart. And like I mentioned earlier, it was their friendship that inspired this thesis. And you can see from my Bapu's eyes, he's the one standing up, how much love he has for his friend. And so this was actually one of the most emotional encounters I've ever experienced and witnessed. It was absolutely beautiful. And I was very lucky. It was actually 2 months after I commenced my PhD, and never did I imagine I would be in Cyprus with Bapu and Mehmet. So I was very, very blessed to have experienced this. Paraskivou, she worked in the fields with Greek and Turkish Cypriot friends, and when the Turkish Cypriots left the village, it was very hard. And she said, I lost my neighbors and friends. It was like my family was split. However, many Turkish Cypriot friends come to visit her now that the checkpoints are open, and they visit and they light a candle in the church each time they visit. And this is linked with what I mentioned before about many of the Turkish Cypriots who had either respect or also faith in Christianity as well, and still practice that. Maria said, I cried and cried when my Turkish Cypriot friends were forced to leave Polis. And when the checkpoints opened, after 29 years of segregation, she was able to then reconnect with her old friends. So this is Maria and Sally, and he came to visit her when I was actually in Cyprus in 2015. And as I mentioned, 32 of my 40 Cyprus interviewees crossed the checkpoints. Maria hadn't actually herself, but she had welcomed visitors from the other side. And so lots of reunions took place. And this is Sermon, and this is a photo he sent me of his Greek Cypriot friends reuniting in Lefkosia. And he actually has written a lot of poetry, as many Cypriots have. And this is an excerpt of one of his poems. And he says, my friends, nearly half a century passes, and now that I have met you again, I still cry helplessly. I cry for Cyprus. I cry for you hopelessly. Nafia talked about her hopes for the future, and she said, I wish Cyprus would come together again. I want Greeks and Turks to live there happily. Maybe generation by generation they will forget all about it. I don't think they will mix again. Each side, they don't know each other. And although a lot of participants really wanted and expressed desire for reunification, some were pessimistic about the practicality of that. And so many have got their hopes up, like many of us over the years, just to have them crushed. So I understand this viewpoint. Giovanni said, my desire is for in the future for us to live together again. I want to come to this climate again. I'm sure that we can do it. There are young people from both sides now cooperating. This is because we had this cooperation. If we come together, I'm sure there'll be no incidents. So just in conclusion, many oral historians and anthropologists contend that only civil and superficial relations existed between Greek and Turkish Cypriots, but my research has shown that prior to the split of the island in 1974, many Greek and Turkish Cypriots, especially in the former mixed villages of Cyprus, lived side by side. They lived very harmoniously in many ways as a single community, and the close personal and community level bonds between the two sides and the common cultural traditions demonstrate very much this intercommunality. Also, the stories of displacement and loss in Reconnection and Hope paint a picture of the entangled lives of many Greek and Turkish Cypriots, and that grief was felt both ways in 74, and that deep connections with the other have persisted through decades of conflict, nationalism, propaganda, and war, and that when the checkpoints opened in 2003, many Greek and Turkish Cypriots crossed to reconnect with old friends. Turkish Cypriots discuss the significant and deep relationships with their Greek Cypriot friends and the Greek Cypriot community as a whole, and this is contrary to their narrative, which contends that relations were always fragile and tense. Greek Cypriots expressed similar sentiment to their narrative, and they told stories and provided photographic evidence which demonstrates that intercommunality did exist in Cyprus, especially in the mixed villages. And finally, the last point I wanted to make was that I didn't realize at the time of starting this project, but these stories were hidden. These stories weren't passed down generation to generation. And when I would visit people in their homes, many of their children and grandchildren were really interested in hearing stories of the old days, and they would sit with us. And something became very clear to me, and that was that these elderly Cypriots had not shared their experiences and their stories of growing up in mixed villages and of intercommunality and friendship with their children and grandchildren. So some of the quotes that I heard during the interviews were, what, you visited a mosque? I didn't know you lived with a Turkish Cypriot family when you first moved to Australia. Mum, you never told me that you spoke Greek as a kid. So these were truly hidden stories. And I think that's one of the reasons why my research is so significant, because it has uncovered this whole hidden past of Cyprus. So thank you. I've stolen this adere image from the Bicommunal Network's website. I love it. So I really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to working with you all in the future to foster unity of all Cypriots and to create lasting change. So thank you for your time, and I'll pass back over to Angelos and Michalis. Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you so much. I think everyone is speechless after this talk. It's really sad that this was used to be the norm, and I think we realized that, you know, we may have lost, when I say we, I mean all Cypriots, properties, land, these kind of things, objects, but it's these friendships, these social relations that cannot be replaced. While properties and lands, okay, they're objects, they can be replaced, doesn't matter. But it's about these social relations that everyone lost because of the conflict. That's irreplaceable. Let's proceed to some of the questions. We have one, the first one from Cyprus Stoner. From my personal experience, the phrase linobambaki is used in an almost accusatory tone for Greek Cypriots who turn to Islam to get better treatment from the Ottoman rulers. Is this not the case? Has the modern Greek Cypriot community twisted the meaning of the word? What's exactly the meaning of linobambaki?
Yes, so that is a really interesting point. And so that is the case in some ways, because there was a non-Muslim tax under the millet system. And so it was easier, I guess, for many Christians to declare that they were Muslim to avoid paying this tax. So some people do suggest that these were truly Christians who just pretended to be Muslims, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that linobambaki went both ways, and that they did actually evolve in many different villages in a way where they did actually adhere to both religious groups, and often that was because they may have had an intermarriage, they may have converted, and they may have had respect for their new religion, but also wanted to maintain their old as well. And so there are many differing kind of views on linobambaki. That's absolutely true. And sometimes it is used in more of that accusative, derogatory sense as well. But many anthropologists believe that this is actually a really beautiful sign of a society where there was this religious cooperation and religious, I guess, tolerance, and how religions actually, and I guess I didn't really touch upon this all that much, but I've written a lot about it in the PhD, which is the religious boundaries were very much blurred. And in villages, it's not as easy to control the populations, I guess. And so like I mentioned about the milk kinship, something that is Islamic then becomes almost Christian, and then Christian practices like Kumbari, for example, would then go into Islamic practices and the Turkish Cypriot practices. So I think linobambaki is also an example of how how porous the religions were, and how they really, the boundaries were very much blurred, and the two religions influenced each other as well. And I think that this is linked a bit also to the linobambaki.
Thank you. Now a short question by Mikis. What's the exact meaning of the word subaltern? Michalis has replied, but that means subordinate, but does it have another more academic meaning?
Yes, so there's a big movement that started in India actually, and it's expanded to Australia with our Indigenous populations, but it's really about the kind of subclass society. So it's not the educated elites, but it's the everyday people who are often uneducated or illiterate and working class. And there's been a movement over the last 2 decades for these groups of people across many countries to reclaim the history of their nations. And I think it's been incredibly effective, and it's very, very important. And like I mentioned, the majority of Cyprus was rural, but the point of view is always portrayed from the political elites, and this is a problem not just in Cyprus, across every country. And so yes, the more academic focus is on giving a voice and giving agency to the lower class populations.
Great. I can see Maria Georgiou raising her hand, and Mihalis, yeah.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, of course.
A big thank you to Stephanie. Thank you to the organizers too. Stephanie, this is a brilliant piece of work. It's amazing, its scale. I mean, for a PhD, as you said, we cannot do everything. So it's really amazing how much you've done and the richness of the data you brought to us today. You've talked a bit about the different, let's say, variables in relation to the participants' identities, such as religion, Linovamvaki, and also the language. So one question I had was whether the Turkish Cypriots who lived in the north and talked Greek identified themselves differently in the group. So I think you gave us the feeling that Linovamvaki somehow differentiated themselves. So I was curious if you had any indication on how the Turkish Cypriot Greek speakers did the same. My second point was the following. You've talked about these variables. I would be also very keen to see different perspectives in relation to gender, men and women, because I know from a different piece of research that the perception of participants changed quite a lot according to their gender. And a bigger picture in relation to the variables. We know from other research that social class is a big variable on identity formation and on how we relate to each other. We also know that the way people related in mixed villages and communities in the cities had to do with power balances and dynamics. I think it's important to pay attention to these, again, variables in inverted commas, because those can shed light to why people so quickly in the 50s turned to arms. For me, it's surprising, and at the same time, it's not, that in 1955 we had EOKA, and then we had Volcan, and then things just escalated. And of course, those things are very much related to colonialism and the processes of decolonization. Whereas in other countries, in each country, we had one movement of becoming our own nation. In Cyprus, there were two communities trying to do that at the same time, which unavoidably brought conflict. So what I'm trying to say, I think it's important to open up the big picture and see all the variables and nuances. Because one of the reasons we do this kind of research is to promote peace and reconciliation. But in order to do so, we need to show the external forces beside us. For example, the relationships with motherlands, with other countries. For example, the Cyprus problem has been called an international problem, and it is. So today we are working towards a solution, but I feel it's not enough to say we lived like brothers, because it's the truth, and it's not just up to us. We need to see forces in our society such as class. For me, the biggest division in Cyprus is not ethnicity, it's social class. We have the subaltern, as you brilliantly showed, and we have the elites. And then we have forces outside the community, which we also need to take into account when we interact to each other. So I'm very curious to hear about what do you have to say about this? Like this complexity, how do we deal with this? How do we bring this complexity into this?
It's extremely complex. I guess to your first point about the Turkish Cypriots who spoke Greek, I didn't actually interview any of them, but I did have a dear friend, Errol, who I interviewed, and he was a policeman, and he said that he had to interview some Turkish Cypriots about a crime that they may have witnessed, and when he went to interview them, he said they couldn't speak a single word of Turkish, they couldn't even say the word bread, they couldn't say anything. So I'm not sure necessarily how they identified, because I didn't conduct that work myself, but certainly they were very much their own subset of society, and they functioned very, I guess, in their own villages, and they were quite, I guess, insular in many ways. I believe they were mostly in the Karpas Peninsula, these villages, and were quite removed from others. But yes, this was difficult, certainly, but I can't speak on their behalf for what their identity was. In terms of gender, I've ensured that with the PhD, I've got a 50% equal balance of Greek and Turkish Cypriots as voices through the quotes, as well as men and women. So I've tried as best actually, that's a bit of a lie. What I realized was when I was writing it up, I thought, okay, I better make sure that there's a balance. So let me just count how many quotes are there of men and women and of Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. And it was so bizarre because it ended up being 50% each without me even trying. And so that's how it happened. And that was something that was really important to me. But I take your point, gender is very different, like there's different perspectives. And certainly from that milk kinship perspective, of course, women have a different understanding and relationship with that because that's their own experience. Whereas for men, it's not, but they still understand the significance. So of course, gender does play a role in people's experiences. Also, women were much more confined to the homes. They were less educated. They went to school less or attended less years of school. And men were the ones who were working more, who were attending more of the school, more of social as well in the Cafe Neon and all of that. And so often men actually had more experiences to draw from because they were more active participants in society than were women. So absolutely gender plays a significant role and a variable when it comes to looking at the fabric of Cypriot society. When it comes to social class, absolutely. And I agree with what you've said. We can see from the British period that they would bring Greek teachers from Greece and Turkish teachers from Turkey. The textbooks would be in Greek and Turkish. They would teach them about the motherlands. And so much of this nationalism was very much bred through the education system. And that's linked with class, as you've mentioned. And so there were very much, like you said, this segregation of society in these two different worlds. But it was not just class, it's political views as well. And I remember going to different villages in Cyprus and people would say to me, oh, no one cares if you're a Greek Cypriot or Turkish Cypriot. All the left wing go to that cafe and all the right wing go to that cafe and they don't mix. Even in Australia, it's the same. Some of the Cypriot communities, for example, the Cypriot community in Adelaide, there's only one community centre and all the left-wing Cypriots sit in these two tables here and all the right-wing Cypriots sit in these tables over here. And so there's still this political divide as well among society. And so these complexities permeate through society. They permeate through, all of the issues that we're trying to grapple with. And there's certainly not just one version of history. And what I've tried to do is just show an alternative view, contrary to some of the common views and the dominant views that are being portrayed, and to just show another side of history. But absolutely, I agree with you that social class is a huge factor here. And that's why when some community leaders and muktari or muktars would offer educated people to me to interview, I was kind of like, oh no, don't give me the teachers, like give me the farmers, because I wanted to focus more on the subaltern and labouring classes. And I was very pleased in the end to actually have interviewed many illiterate people, mostly women, from my project. And actually I think some of the most richness, most eloquent, sophisticated viewpoints and experiences came from the less educated.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sorry, Maria.
Thank you so much. Congratulations. It's indeed very rich data, and I would be very curious to read the paper comparing, let's say, teachers and farmers, or men and women, when you have time to follow up on this. Thank you again. Thank you so much.
Stephanie, I would like to share with you the enormous gratitude of not only of us, the members of the team and the reps and everyone in the network, but also of all participants. Like, honestly, we have a cataclysm of messages, questions, comments. It's unbelievable, but also it's a bit alarming, because it's again a sign of how much people from both communities want to interact, want to share past experiences, want to discuss everything, and it's so rare nowadays, unfortunately. I would lastly like to share a very personal experience from this lecture, of this talk. I would have not imagined that it would have been so emotional at points, especially at the image of your grandfather meeting his best friend, shaking hands. Honestly, it almost brought me to tears. And yes, I would like just to pass to Angelos to see if he wants to add anything, but we are going to collect all the comments and questions, etc., because there are also people who try to network, researchers, to come in touch with you, to reply, to get a reply for their questions. I just want to reassure everyone that nothing will be lost from the chat, and we'll make sure to come up with the saved, the recorded video, so that anyone can access it whenever he wants, he or she wants in the future. And yeah.
Wonderful, thank you.
Angela?
Thank you, Mihaly. Yeah. We can go on forever answering questions, and it's really a flood of questions that we've been getting. And could we approach 2 or 3 more questions? Do we have the time?
I'm happy to. Sure.
Mm-hmm. So, very interesting question by Petros and Alex. I will read Petros' question. I was wondering whether you captured in your interviews any counter narratives about the coexistence of Greek and Turkish Cypriots not always being harmonious and peaceful before the intensification of intercommunal conflict. Can you talk a little bit about them? And if you didn't, how would you explain that, the fact that such narratives did not emerge?
So I guess I did hear a few. I'm delighted that Petros is here and in attendance. I will just mention a couple of things. So the first is that when I did my interviews, I picked 3 villages in Cyprus. As I mentioned, what I forgot to say was that I interviewed the people who are still remaining there, as well as the displaced people. So I actually was able to marry the stories of Greek and Turkish Cypriots from the same villages together. And I was able to analyze that information and confirm that the stories that they were telling of intercommunality were common between the 2 communities. It wasn't just one community saying it and not the other, but these people from the same villages were saying it. So I think that gives a lot of credibility to the data. In terms of the counter narratives, I did hear stories, but they were small. They weren't of like actual intercommunal tensions. It was more of personality conflicts that people have anywhere in any city or town or village in the world. But there was a story of Eleni in Alaminos, and she said, when I asked her about, how she felt when the Turkish Cypriots left the village, she, and like I said, many people were very heartbroken, but she said, no, I was relieved. I was relieved to see them go. There was just so much pain and so much trauma. You know, the relationship had deteriorated so significantly, but when they left, I was actually happy to see them leave. So I certainly did hear some stories like that out of relief. But I also heard stories, and I guess some of this was not so much the Greek and Turkish Cypriots, but of Greek soldiers and Turkish soldiers, and some of the trauma that was experienced by people at the hands of those soldiers as well during the conflict. But yes, I take the point that the overwhelming majority of stories were very positive. And I guess that was the focus of the research project. And some people did open up to me about their trauma and others didn't. And I very much did not want to pry and try and bring out some of those negative stories. So I think when I did hear something negative, like I said, it was the minor personality kind of issues. And obviously the stories of the conflict themselves and how difficult that was. But maybe with the very, very significant issues, people didn't want to talk about those, and not necessarily because they were just trying to fit into the narrative that I'm trying to get across and the argument I'm trying to put forward, but that it was just very traumatic. I mean, I heard stories of rape and things like that during the conflicts, and so some people just don't really want to bring that up, I guess. And it was already it was already quite emotional for a lot of people to talk about this. So I certainly didn't want to pry too deep. So I do take that point though. Yeah, thank you both for that question.
Thank you. Now a question by Ertem, and then we'll finish with Elena Ioannidou. Ertem asks, I was wondering if you had the chance to collect some data from the children and grandchildren of the people you interviewed on their current views of the other community.
Unfortunately, I didn't capture any data, but one of my main goals from my research project is to, I guess, highlight to our generation and younger how our grandparents lived previously, because I do think there's real issues with the way that many of our generation have been taught about the history of Cyprus. And of course, you know, many of the family members have experienced a lot of trauma, but I find some of the youth to have taken on that secondary trauma very significantly, and that I can see as a real hindrance to some of the reunification efforts. So unfortunately, I didn't capture the data, but I felt that I was able to have influence a little bit by having younger people sitting on the interviews. And I certainly am trying to spread my research through forums like this and through academic conferences, through my blog, to engage the youth of Cyprus as well as the diaspora to understand about the shared past and to try and inspire us to think about ways that we can have a shared future again as well. So yes, unfortunately, I didn't capture that data.
Thank you, Elena.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow, I'm very emotional as well. I just want to say well done. And I am working, this is the 10th year, I'm working with narratives of Turkish Cypriot. I'm working at the University of Cyprus, and we have a long ethnographic project on Turkish Cypriots who speak Greek only, or who used to speak Greek only. So yes, this is about what you said before. They are called Romaica speakers. They use the term Romaica.
Okay.
And I decided in my project not to use the term Linobambagi because, as you said, and that's the comment I would like to make actually, Linobambagi is a politically charged term. It has been exploited by more nationalist Greek Cypriots who would like to prove that Turkish Cypriots never existed. So
Yes,
I use, I use the term Romaica, which is the term that came out from the community when they say that their Greek is Romaica. So we call them Romaica speakers. I would love to be in touch with you, Stephanie. I mean, this is great stuff. I have so many things I would like to go on about, but we don't have the time. I just wanted to say that at the university, we have a big project about this, and many of the things you've said, we've encountered, but also you said new things about, for example, people who are not displaced but stayed behind, or about the milk mothers. So, you know, you definitely have a lot of new stuff to bring in. And yeah, I just wanted to say that we're here, and we're very, very happy to hear about this. And also just a final comment. The people who spoke Greek only, Romaica, were not only in Paphos. Many are in Carpathia. A lot are in Lourougina and the around villages. So there's definitely a lot of more research to be done. And I was very, very happy to hear about this. Actually, I didn't know about it. I just, you know, found out last minute, but well done, and well done to the organizers as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I love to be in touch. So
we will be, yes, definitely.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you again for the talk. It was really, really emotional, and I'm sure everyone learned things that they didn't know about. And as Mihalis said, there were points that we were almost brought to tears. And we apologize for all the questions we left unanswered. Perhaps, Stephanie, how can people contact you to ask any questions? Or
yes, maybe I can just write in the chat my email address, but also you can find me on Facebook as well. So I'll just put my email address here now. And then you can also find me on Facebook. Oh, did I send that privately to Angelos? Oops. Oh no, let me do it to everyone. Sorry. Yes, so otherwise, yes, please find me on Facebook as well. And sorry, I'm just typing now. And I also have a website, which is just stephaniejacobs.com. And so you can also contact me through there. There we go. I'll just do my website.
okay, thank you so much again for everything, and thank you everyone for attending. Definitely, Stephanie has given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure for the next days our minds will be busy processing everything that we have seen today. So yeah, it's very important for us to be together, and I would like to say that even if there is no political solution, it's important that we stay together as one people, and not be socially divided. And at least, despite all the sadness that things are not as they used to be, as we've seen in Stephanie's talk, it gives us hope. I think that things can be like this in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. I'm very honored that you all attended. So thank you. And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.